Jupiter smiles on all of you. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you are no doubt aware, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 60,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again is audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you will qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There's no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book that you downloaded. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I'm going to recommend picking up Augustus by Anthony Everett. Everett is clear and accessible, and this biography in particular was a great aid while I was crafting the episodes on Rome's first emperor. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 70, Galba and Otho. So the History of Rome is now married and settled into our new global headquarters in Austin, Texas. It was an eventful break, and the last few weeks saw some pretty major changes in my life. As fun as it all was, though, I'm eager to get back to the comfortable weekly rhythm of the show, so without further ado, let's get to it. You'll remember that in early 68 AD, Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of one of the Gallic provinces, rose up in a revolt against Nero. Vindex tried to convince old Servius Sulpicius Galba, governor of the largest province in Spain, to join him and lead a wider rebellion, but Galba refused to commit to the fight, and Vindex's revolt was put down by Lucius Virginius Rufus, commander of the legions on the Upper Rhine. But the legions on the Rhine were not driven by any deep love for Nero, and having defeated Vindex, they tried to convince Virginius himself to lead them all in rebellion against Nero. But Virginius refused. Though Vindex's rebellion was technically put down, and Virginius remained loyal, these events signaled to the empire that Nero's star was fading fast, and that it was time to flee from the sinking ship. In Rome, the Praetorian prefect Nymphidius Sabinus told his men that if they abandoned Nero and supported the aforementioned Galba, that the old governor of Spain would pay them all off handsomely. Galba had said no such thing, but he had decided that the time to break publicly with Nero was at hand. With every important commander turning on the emperor, the Senate seized the opportunity to be rid of Nero, declared him a public enemy, and called for his execution, a fate Nero escaped only by committing suicide. With Nero dead, the Senate sent word that they were ready to recognize Galba as the new Caesar. In just a few short months, Galba had gone from a provincial governor contemplating retirement to absolute ruler of the Roman Empire. All that was left to do was march on Rome and assume the throne. I think that is about where we left off. Galba's brief reign as emperor would be stormy, to say the least. The storm was in part his own fault, both for things he had done in the past and things he would do now that he was in power. But the fact is that Otho was able to find murderous accomplices within the ranks of the Praetorian Guard, not because of what Galba was doing per se, but because Galba refused to keep promises that Galba had never actually made. From the moment it looked like sticking with Nero would be suicide, Nymphidius Sabinus had been promising all kinds of riches to the troops under his command if they backed Galba. The prefect made all these promises as if he was simply relaying messages received from Galba, but mostly he was just telling whoppers and hoping that they would come true later. I think that probably most Roman politicians in Galba's shoes, arriving in Rome to news that the Praetorians were expecting X amount as a donative, would have felt compelled to pay the money. But Galba was a peculiar bird, and a world-class miser. He scoffed at Sabinus' promises, and then naively went about his business as if canceling the bonuses would have no serious consequences. Of course, by this point, Sabinus had already been murdered by his own men, so maybe Galba figured that everyone understood that anything the prefect had said was now moot. But I am getting a bit ahead of myself. Galba did not immediately leave for Rome in the days following his ascension. He was, after all, still governor of a rich and independent-minded province. He had to make sure that Spain would not fall apart when its longtime administrator suddenly left on more important business. He lingered for a month, raising a new legion to accompany him on the march to Rome, and finding the right man to take over governance of the province. As an aside, the man Galba chose to succeed him signaled Galba's priorities, or more accurately, the priorities of his three advisors, Vinius, Laco, and Icelus, when it came to appointing governors. Cluvius Rufus was a well-respected senator, but a man with no military experience. It was a mold that Galba would use for other key provincial appointments, most notably Vitellius's eventual command of the legions on the Lower Rhine. The three pedagogues had no intention of putting experienced military men at the head of large armies. That was, after all, how they had just come to power, and they weren't about to let anyone else repeat the process. Galba finally shoved off for Rome in July, but was soon met by a delegation from the Senate, bringing news that things in the capital were getting out of hand. Galba's continued absence from the city had allowed the ambitions of Sabinus to grow at an exponential rate. The Praetorian prefect had apparently decided that it was no longer enough to simply back a new emperor. He now actually wanted to be that new emperor. To that end, Sabinus had begun passing around a rumor that he was actually the son of Caligula, and thus the rightful Julio-Claudian heir to Nero. But Sabinus hung himself before Galba or the Senate had a chance to respond. Already somewhat ashamed of themselves for having turned on Nero so readily, a good chunk of the guard was mortally offended that Sabinus was now calling on them to abandon Galba before the latter even had a chance to arrive in Rome. Were they really such a dishonorable lot that their loyalties would simply shift at the slightest breeze? When Sabinus arrived at the Praetorian camp, ready to accept the title of Caesar, he was instead greeted by an angry mob. They allowed their prefect through the gate, and then they locked the door behind him. Sabinus did not make it out of the camp alive. Honor aside, there was really no reason to turn on Galba just yet anyway. After all, there was the matter of that huge bonus they had been promised. The case of the missing donative, as I said, was a landmine that the unsuspecting Galba would eventually step on, but in his defense, it was at least a landmine laid by someone else. On his march from Spain to Rome, though, Galba did plenty enough damage to his own reputation without anyone else's help. When he finally got to Italy and stepped on the mine that was laid by Sabinus, Galba was already politically wounded enough that rather than just knock him around some, the blast would actually be enough to finally kill him. There are a couple of schools of thought about how best to ascend to the throne following a coup-like situation. One is embodied by Julius Caesar, who was forever pardoning his enemies and exuding a spirit of such generosity and forgiveness that you couldn't help but love the guy. The other was embodied by Octavian, who ruthlessly purged all his enemies so that when he seized power, he could play the revolution. Galba followed the path of Octavian, but did so without the slightest hint of political savvy or decency. In Roman society, it was one thing to kill your enemies. It was quite another to kill their wives and children. It was one thing to execute a few troublemakers within an unruly legion. It was quite another to slaughter entire cohorts just beyond the walls of Rome because you don't like their attitude. When he left Spain, Galba was seen as a wise and experienced leader, capable of saving the empire from the excesses of Nero. But by the time he arrived in Rome, he was seen as an inflexible and cruel tyrant. As Tacitus says, everyone agreed that Galba would make an excellent emperor until he actually became emperor. The dastardly crime of killing wives and children came early on as Galba consolidated his hold over Spain. Governors and procurators in the region who did not immediately offer their full-throated support for the new Caesar were rounded up along with their families and murdered. The indecency of this purge was at first missed in all the confusion, but word of what had happened would trail Galba on his trip to Rome and then linger as further proof that the increasingly disliked Galba was in fact a monster. The new emperor exacerbated the situation by treating towns he passed as enemy fortresses if they did not immediately submit to his authority. Otherwise perfectly loyal and peaceful settlements were sacked by Galba's men, who acted like a conquering army on the march through enemy territory. Galba arrived at the outskirts of Rome in October, and by that time, everyone knew what a swath he had cut across the Western Empire. the Romans braced themselves to greet their savior. But before he set foot in the city, Galba blasted out the final chunk of what was left of his reputation. Prior to committing suicide, Nero had raised a new legion, composed mostly of ex-Marines and sailors. In the hierarchy of the Roman armed forces, Marines and sailors were a barely acknowledged necessity, whereas full legionnaires were respected and granted all sorts of privileges. Not wanting to give up their so recently acquired bump in status, soldiers from the new legion greeted Galba at the Milvian Bridge and demanded that he legalize their promotions. Galba ordered them to disperse, but they refused, which Galba took to be nothing less than rank insubordination and possibly treason. When a few in the petitioning legion drew their swords to show that they meant business, Galba snapped and ordered his legion to attack. This was not simply meant to be a terrifying display of force. Galba was deadly serious, and in the ensuing massacre, thousands from the new legion were killed. When the fighting stopped, Galba rounded up the survivors and decided to revive the long-since discarded practice of decimation, whereby 1 out of every 10 men was selected by lots and put to death. The punished legion was in shock at having to submit to this archaic and cruel punishment. Galba's own men were disgusted by the display, and the people of Rome were horrified. Galba simply stated that he was acting well within the bounds of military law, and though he was right on the statutory point, politically he could not have been more wrong. When he finally entered the city, Galba was a feared and hated man. After just a few months in office, he was so thoroughly despised that it's a wonder he even lasted into the middle of January. It's not that Galba wasn't trying. It was just that he had the political instincts of a lemming and couldn't stop running headlong over the nearest cliff. The one and only major issue he tackled during his reign was trying to clean up the empire's finances, and he bungled that so badly that even his most ardent supporters conceded that Galba was not well suited for his new position. Nero had left an enormous financial mess to clean up, and the people likely would have given Galba the benefit of the doubt as he tried to wade through it all. But the new emperor pursued such a tone-deaf cleanup operation that whatever goodwill he had coming to him was immediately squandered. Though, in the end, responsibility for the majority of his ill-advised plans has been laid squarely at the feet of the 3 pedagogues, the buck, as they say, stopped with Galba at the time. Taking their first look at the official books, Galba and his advisors quickly understood the severity of the situation. Nero had effectively cleaned out the state reserves and left the empire essentially broke. Knowing that the vast majority of the funds had been spent either building the Golden Palace or been handed out to court favorites as gifts, Galba decided to simply recover the dispersed funds. But as the treasury officials knocked on doors looking for the money, it became clear that most of it had already been spent by those who had received it. In many cases, the money had been spent on a variety of gifts that the court favorites had issued to clients as part of the patronage system that defined Roman political life. So, while the money itself quickly became untraceable, the purchased items themselves were cataloged and pursued by the treasury officials. Galba's officers soon found themselves ordered to seize property from families who had acquired the goods in question blamelessly. Thus, rather than coming down hard on Nero's old accomplices, the burden was borne by men only tangentially related to the emperor's excesses. This, as you can imagine, was not a very popular policy. The larger plan was to auction off the seized property to re-raise the cash that had been lost. But with so much economic uncertainty,